Okay, hi everyone. Paul Krugman with another, after a little bit of a hiatus, another video discussion, returning to Elliott Morris, my favorite polling public opinion analyst, because we've had an eventful time with redistricting. There's a lot of stuff going on. So, see where this goes. Hi, Elliott.
Hi, Paul. I'm happy to be back here with my favorite economist. So thank you
All
for the
right.
nice
That's
introduction.
Yeah, I want to come back eventually to some of the more sort of economistic stuff, but the big news is, of course, the court. You know, I think to this leaving Democrats stunned by overruling the referendum with Virginia redistricting, which now gives Republicans a substantial lead in that whole redistricting thing.
Yep.
How should we? You've been doing some analysis. How should we think about how this changes? The November.
Yeah, big picture is as long as Democrats are still winning the popular vote by 4 points, they're still taking back the House of Representatives. A lot has changed over the last 3 weeks. First, the Supreme Court has invalidated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This was the portion of the law that prevented state legislatures or other state bodies from diluting the power of black voters.
Right.
This, of course, matters for our partisan calculations because black representatives in the South tend to be Democrats. Now the Supreme Court has said states can divvy up their votes. Republican-led states in the South, including Tennessee, Alabama, and Louisiana, have since passed or are about to pass maps that will take away 3 Democrats, at least, potentially
Okay.
5. So that is quite a few seats. On top of that, there has been other redistricting news. Virginia, which had passed, the voters from which had passed a constitutional amendment to adopt a Democratic gerrymander, that has been struck down. So Democrats in Virginia are going back to their old map, and they will lose 2 seats because of that. 2 seats that they would have otherwise gained. So if you're like catching up on the math here, that's 1 seat. That's 3 seats lost from the Democrats. It would have only been 1. Now it's 3. Okay, but then we have redistricting in Texas, in Florida, in North Carolina, Ohio, Missouri. If you add up all of those Republican states, they have taken away about 13 seats from the Democrats, and Democrats have gained only 5 or so out of California, the only state they have really redistricted. If you add up all of this, then Democrats are down about 6 seats from from the gerrymandering wars that Donald Trump started last year, and that could be potentially decisive in a close race.
My very informal impression was that prior to all of this stuff, the kind of Republican bias of the voting was largely gone. That the House majorities tended to more or less reflect the popular vote. But now we're in a
Yeah,
situation we're back with a probably the biggest ever Republican lean there.
yeah. So the 2024 congressional map was technically still biased toward the Republicans. If in a perfectly average year with perfectly average candidates, and that is the big if, 2024 had been rerun, we would have expected Democrats to lose the majority of seats, even if they had won the popular vote by about a point. 1.1
Okay.
points. The big benefit in 2024 was that recruitment by Democrats in close seats was really, really good. So they beat expectations. But if you rerun, it still would have been slightly biased towards Republicans. Okay, now we're at around a Republican bias of 4 points, which is close to the 2020 bias. Sorry, close to the bias right after the 2010 redistricting
Oh, okay.
happened in 2012 plans. So this is pretty bad. We're getting to the point where the structural bias in basically every electoral institution at the federal level is significantly overweighting Republican votes just by the fact of where they live or who's in charge of drawing the maps there.
Okay, yeah. A few weeks ago, I talked with Kim Lane Sheffley, my old friend from Princeton, about Hungary, and a lot of what Orban did was, in fact, basically whatever the Hungarian word for gerrymandering is, but on a heroic scale. She said that they basically weighted rural voters by about 3 to 1 over urban
Yep.
voters. Um, but of course, that was overtopped by huge wave election So, and you would still think that the most likely scenario, or given the current polling, it's probably still the Democrats are going to probably crest that dam.
I think the 2026 election will be significantly pro-democratic, that the gerrymandering won't matter in terms of who wins the majority of the seats.
Right.
Democrats will still be down 6 seats at least from where they should be, but if they're gaining 12, then they're still managing to recapture the House because it was so close last time. Republicans only had 3 extra seats at the last election, so it's a pretty easy wave election for the Democrats. But they'll still be down seats, like they're still deprived of representation in the South, and more importantly, in 2028, when we're not expecting Democrats to have such a large wave, right? Like maybe unless the country comes to its senses. I know you talk a lot about tariffs here. That's a big example. Then you're expecting a much closer election. And in that scenario, 2028 scenario, this gerrymandering could give Republicans the majority, even if Democrats win the popular vote.
Just a quick amateur question on this stuff, and then we can get on to other things. But to what extent is there the dummy-mander thing, the possibility that if it's a Democratic wave, particularly, I think I was thinking about the Hispanic vote, that the Republicans may have drawn these districts on the belief that the 2024 Hispanic vote was going to remain, and they seem to have really lost that now. But at least if the polling is at all right, does this mean possibility that the Democrats actually the Republicans have they've essentially diluted their own support in order to wipe out Democratic districts, that they've opened the possibility of losing a lot of normally red seats?
So it's a great question. I've done some math on this, my own simulations of election outcomes, where I assume
by the way,
national.
Because you've done the math on this.
I've done the math, Paul.
I don't know. No,
there's a calculus calculator behind me. Don't look too carefully.
Yeah.
There's So Republicans basically went after 5 districts in Texas.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 of 3 of those are highly susceptible to a dummy-mander. In which case, if you do the math and Latinos move 20 points toward the Democrats, and everyone else only moves 10 points to the Democrats, so you just assume Latinos are moving twice as much as everyone else, which is pretty close to what happened in the 2025 elections.
Yeah.
Then Republicans only gain 2 seats out of Texas, but they're still gaining seats. So there is a possibility that they have drawn themselves too thin in the case of a big Latino sort of backlash, but they're just subtracting some seats that they could have otherwise gained. They're still getting. So it's not the fact that they're going to lose overall in terms of the overall gerrymandering. In other words, they're still coming out ahead.
Okay, that's slightly depressing, but okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. You can't answer this, but just I find myself wondering if there's, if we really have it's a very clear, massive public backlash against Republicans, but these maneuvers keep them in control of the House. How much damage does this do to legitimacy, to feelings about the government? I don't know.
I don't know how much worse feelings of legitimacy or approval of the government could get. I mean, approval of Congress is 20%, SCOTUS is 20%. Trump's approval rating is 35% only by virtue of that question being really partisan polarized. If you actually ask Americans how they approve of Donald Trump's handling of stuff like prices and tariffs, then it's closer to 25. So it would be very striking to have lower confidence in the U.S. government to solve the problems of the everyday people. Basically, this might make an impact on how Americans view the functioning of their democracy or what have you. And actually, from my point of view, that type of education could be useful for stuff like electoral reform, proportional representation, but we don't have to get into that for now. But it's pretty bad out there. It's pretty bleak out there, Paul. Yeah, it's not good.
The unpopularity of Donald Trump is really extraordinary. The unpopularity of the policies. Things have really gone downhill. Things were really going downhill, I think, even before the Iran war. So do you have a story? I mean, I want to talk about the broader issue of economic vibes and all of that, but let's talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, if I'm telling the story of the Trump administration, I'm looking at four main events. Okay, I'm looking at, well,
Okay.
besides his inauguration, which is itself a sort of
Right.
negative signal to the American people. I'm looking at the Liberation Day tariffs in April of last year, which caused a drop in Donald Trump's approval rating, and then mostly trickled along at the same, slightly dipping as every day people are realizing what the administration is doing.
Yeah.
They tend to react just negatively to the president, regardless of what he does. This was true for Biden as well, by the way. It's just a sort of weird factor of political psychology here. And then the next event I'm looking at is sort of confluence of immigration events that are happening from May to June of 2025. So you have the deportation of Kilmar Vega Garcia. You have these Donald Trump sends the National Guard to LA and to Chicago. And this creates a lot of negative press attention for him. And you see his approval rating on the economy and deportations and overall drop again by about 5 or 10 points. And then he trickles around, he's losing support. And then over the next 6 months, really not much happens in his approval rating. And then the government shutdown happens.
Right.
And a lot of Americans come around to the news that Donald Trump has basically defunded a lot of Medicaid, and premiums are going to increase. That, of course, sets in January of this year. And then I would be looking at the Iran war. You would also want to add the killings in Minnesota as well. That was a big signal to Americans about the negative outcomes of Trump's deportation agenda and militarization of U.S. cities, essentially. So those events are about immigration and prices. The healthcare thing is still kind of a price anxiety. And you can see his approval rating dropping. His approval rating was positive when he started. He's at minus 25 or so now in our polling. He's closer to minus 30. So that is, like, it is worth emphasizing. Nobody likes Donald Trump.
Right.
Like, very few people like Donald Trump. If you walk down the street, the average American street, you will encounter between 1 out of 3 and 1 out of 4 people. 3 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 people who actively support what he is doing. And that's very low for a president of the United States historically. And in absolute terms, it's just worth emphasizing that people do not like this period.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that he did have a positive approval briefly.
He had a bit of a honeymoon, when he started.
But it really deflated very fast, and it's extraordinary, actually. You think of it, it's kind of almost hard. It feels like much longer ago than it was.
There seems to be an awful lot of on the part of congressional Republicans, enabling of Donald Trump. A lot more than you would expect based on his approval ratings overall and his approval ratings in their districts. Now, we know that Trump, from a narcissistic point of view, in my opinion, reacts to public opinion. He shares the polls when they're good, and he calls them fake news when they're bad. He's constantly talking about how much the public loves him. That is the type of thing a narcissist would do. But in terms of reining in political actions from the White House, I do think we've seen rather little, in fact, evidence that the polls are meaningfully moving him. Now, there are a couple of cases. The big one is the retreat from Minneapolis after the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy there, and there was a dramatic increase in support for abolishing ICE and a dramatic decrease in approval ratings for ICE and approval rating for the president's immigration and deportations agenda right after that. So that did seem to matter in terms of the public opinion. But look, I think we're in an environment where most legislators, but especially on the right, are insulated from the general electorate's opinions, especially the opinions of the average person who might not turn out to vote. And that is enabling an awful lot of bad behavior on the part of the president. And partisanship is really an overwhelming force for bad on the right, given the president's proclivities. So I think you are right here to say, the polls are the polls. It is important to say that people don't like this, but Trump is not necessarily the type of actor you would expect given that information.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder whether almost every day of some scandalous or just outrageous behavior, Kash Patel's personal brand of bourbon, all of that stuff. But one of the things I learned from you is that the swing voters are. I like that you have a very straightforward definition of badly, poorly informed, which is just do they know who controls Congress? But
Right.
that's a lot of the. I wonder whether any of this stuff even reaches a lot of voters.
Yeah, I doubt the average person knows about the Cash Patel whiskey, the Cash Money
Yeah.
whiskey, by the way. That I'm a big fan of whiskey, and that seems like a real betrayal to all the whiskey fans. So I think there's there's a problem here, which is that most legislators just really don't care what the public thinks,
Right.
including in their district and including overall. And really nowhere is that clearer than on the Republican Party when Donald Trump is, passing tariffs that will cause inflation or asking for $1 billion for his ballroom, and et cetera. And the voters who aren't really paying attention to the news might not hear about that stuff, but it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And they are getting signals of the president's incompetence from stuff like gas prices going up and just general news environment being bad about the president of the United States. So some of this does filter through to them.
Okay. Let's go on to vibe session. I have to say that uh, um, a lot of payoff to in this sort of economics business punditry world for turns of phrase. And Carla Scanlon with the vibe session, as I think
Yeah,
she's
she should get a
set
Nobel
for life.
Prize for Vibe Session.
Yeah, she's set for life on just that one term. Although she's actually very good on other things, but that's just. But it is quite amazing, right? You probably I think I'm probably on different mailing lists. So just before we recorded this, the latest survey of household economic dynamics from the Fed came out, and it's so as even leaving aside the sort of approval ratings and so on, the um, uh, public public opinion, public views about how they're doing. Most people still say we're doing okay, but the views about the state of the economy uh, have just fallen off a cliff. People are, as we might expect given stuff, that people are incredibly negative, and it's still, well, why don't you take, the first question is, do we think that in some sense, are we willing to say that people are more negative than the reality justify? I don't know if that might be more, but anyway, do you have a take on that?
I yeah, I will just respond directly to the last thing, which
Yeah.
is yes, there is a vibe session. The vibes are still lower than you would expect given um, fundamental indicators, and even this one that Jared Bernstein has proposed that I've sort of
Right.
back tested in some modeling, the excess inflation number. Even if you account for excess inflation or just price levels being higher than people expect, consumer sentiment is still, as measured by the University of Michigan, about 10 to 15 index points lower than you would expect. So that there is still some level of anxiety out there that is breaking from our historical understanding of economic anxiety. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so you think that there is, in fact, still that even with the price level stuff I want to get to, but even with the price level, there's still some mystery component, at least based on the consumer confidence index.
Yeah, I guess the other way to say it is that the models, these historical models that predict consumer sentiment
Right.
still are missing something. Maybe they're missing like people are reacting more to inflation now than unemployment or other structural variables than they were in the past, and you might need to you have to find some way to account for that. I mean, I've tried every way possible, and you just even if you p hack it, you really can't get there.
By the way,
There's
p
a
hacking again. People may not know, but p hacking, is essentially playing with variables until you get something that is statistically significant, except it isn't
right
really because you've tried all the alternatives to find the thing that seems to work.
by random chance you would have arrived at an answer, but
Yeah.
what I'm saying here is even by random chance you like cannot arrive at a prediction of consumer sentiment that is perfect. There's some fundamental break around 2 years ago in the vibes about the economy. And it's lower if you account for stuff like excess prices, and that's got to be an important part of our story. There's some sort of section of internet commentators, mainly on Blue Sky, who insist that the economy is actually good and the vibes are just wrong for no reason. I don't think that is right, but I wouldn't go so far as to say there's no vibe session, right? I think somewhere in the middle.
Okay, but you think that it's that we actually that things have sort of are worse now relative to the fundamentals than they were in 2023?
Yes, if you predict consumer sentiment with with excess inflation and the S&P 500 and economic growth and such, you can get a very good prediction, almost perfect, out of sample until December 2024, January 2025.
Okay.
Which is awfully a convenient result if you are focusing on Trump-related sources of economic pressure. But it also is around the time when the president started passing inflationary policies. So it could just be that people after January 2025 were hyper aware of inflationary policies like tariffs or just the horse in the hospital aspect of this presidency. Maybe they're mapping that onto their economic sentiment. I'm still searching for answers for the last year or so, but if you include excess prices in your model of consumer sentiment, this basically fixes the original vibe session aspect through the end of 2024. But now we're in a sort of different vibe session environment, perhaps related to Trump. I'm not sure.
Okay, so vibe session 2, which is to go along with Trump 2. It's let me actually, I'll lose the thread if I don't pursue this. So you really are saying there is basically the vibe session 2, which is interesting, that there's something that goes beyond all the solutions that we've tried to find to explain why people were so depressed in 2024. Now, even with all of that, something else has happened now.
Yeah, I think I can explain the vibe session of 2022, 2023, and 2024 very well. Excess prices, excess price shock.
Right.
And I don't think we have a good explanation, empirically or otherwise. Economically or otherwise, for like the 2025, 2026 vibe session. Vibe session 2, electric boogaloo. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. No, I mean, from the point of view of somebody, who obsessively follows policy in the news, well, of course, people are feeling really bad because we have crazy tariffs and we have we have cuts to healthcare, and Trump is so terrible. So of course, people are feeling terrible. But I don't think that that's a very good. What's going on in my mind is a very bad model of what's going on in the minds of the average American. So, but there is something going on there.
If I were like putting on my political scientist, maybe like political psychologist hat, it is very possible that the excessive, maybe not excessive, but the amount of coverage about the Biden economy, in derogatory, and inflation, and the blame of the president for inflation in 2022, 2023, caused it perhaps caused voters to think about the president more in thinking about the direction of the national economy, and therefore, if that is true, then getting a figure like Trump into office would cause a pretty negative backlash in overall economic sentiment, even if it's not causing this negative backlash in personal financial situation, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny. I mean, again, it probably doesn't matter for the public views, but in my view, is that Biden, for the most part, bore very little responsibility for that inflation. That it was it was supply chain disruptions as in the aftermath of COVID, and it happened all. European Union inflation was basically identical to U.S. inflation, but this time around, you really have to say, well, really, the 3.8% inflation that we just got this really is. You could definitely put this is really Trumpflation, at least for the time being.
Yeah, Jerome Powell said so. Daddy said so. So you got to listen.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing. Excess prices. So for listeners, one of the things that really comes to in all of these discussions, economists like to talk about inflation, which is the rate at which prices are rising, and the conventional approaches to trying to understand consumer sentiment talk about inflation and then unemployment and maybe some other things as well. But but if you talk to people, actual people, means not people like not us, but if you talk to actual people, they talk a lot about what things cost. And so there's this argument that says that people are upset because even though inflation came way down from its peak in 2022, that but prices didn't. The level of prices leveled off rather than coming down. But this raises a lot of problems. So why don't we talk about the excess inflation? And then I think I may have actually differ with you on something, but raise an issue anyway.
So this this work is based on the theory that voters react negatively to a shock in prices,
Right.
with or really a shock in inflation, especially if inflation had been low for some amount of time, 20, 30 years in the most recent case. To measure excess prices, I've built on the economist Jared Bernstein's work, who I know you had. I was sadly unable to make that podcast with you because I was under the weather.
But anyway, yeah.
And so our model for this is to predict what prices would have been today using inflation from the last 20 years or so, and then to measure the residual between actual prices, nominal prices, and the prediction of prices. And at least in my work, when I say prices, I mean the index price of vehicles, of shelter, and of food. But the results are actually the same if you use PCE. But I've used those
PCE,
variables
by the
because
sorry,
about the lingo.
Personal consumption
The Federal
expenditure
Reserve's
price index, which is like the CPI, like Consumer Price Index, but it's arguably a little bit better. And the Federal Reserve relies on the PCE.
Yeah. So it really doesn't matter what goods you're looking at. Today, goods are about 15% higher, or prices are 15% higher, roughly speaking, than they would have been given 2% inflation over the last 6 years or so, basically since COVID. If you add that variable to some model of consumer sentiment that has otherwise traditional measures of economic activity, like inflation, the S&P 500, unemployment, then you do get a much better prediction of consumer sentiment over time, and including in the 1970s when prices were when the change in the price level was even worse than it was over COVID.
Yeah, again, maybe for listeners, there's what I think of as the Morning in America problem. If you think that people are upset now because things cost a lot more than they did before COVID, then you have the question of, well, that was also true in 1984 under Ronald Reagan, and prices were, in fact, it turns out that the increase in consumer prices in Ronald Reagan's first term was almost identical in percentage terms to the increase in prices under Biden. But of course, Ronald Reagan ran as a triumphant rescuer of the U.S. economy. It's Morning in America, and Biden was deeply unpopular. And the explanation, which I think all of us working on this have kind of come at, is that at the beginning of the 1980s, people were expecting lots more inflation,
right?
And at the beginning of in 2021, they were not, and that's kind of what you're measuring.
Yeah, and this isn't just me talking either. If you look at the sort of political scientist voter psychology work on what they call retrospective economic perceptions, or just your rating of the economy, and you predict those ratings of the economy based off of changes in economic indicators, then inflation causes a much more negative impact on economic evaluations after a period of what they call good times, when inflation is low. So psychologically, this works too. If people are primed to see increases in prices of 10, 15% for a decade, and then they see it again, they empirically, historically, throughout the United States, react less negatively than they do in, say, your COVID era price spike after 30 years of low inflation.
Yeah. Although what is kind of interesting, and I know that you've been doing statistical modeling, and I'm just pulling stuff out of my.
Well, I'm not an economist.
I know, but I'm.
I don't have a Nobel laureate.
Well, yeah, but that was a long time ago. But anyway, mid 70s, people were still completely shocked. I mean, I'm also an old guy, and I remember the 70s, and we were all really really shocked. And yet, uh, consumer sentiment, even in the Ford administration, was not as negative as it has been lately. And it's still a little bit of times have been really good in the 60s and up through about 73, and it's I'm still kind of shocked at just how bad things are, how bad the perceptions are now. But your
Well,
model says you seem to track the 70s okay.
they do, yeah. If you and they do because of this adjustment for the good times versus the bad times.
Yeah.
So if you take our excess price measure, which again is just the percent difference between expected prices and actual prices in nominal terms, and you adjust for the average inflation in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, over the last decade,
Yeah.
then you essentially decrease the excess price measure for the 70s and hold it about constant for the post-COVID period, mainly 2023 being the peak, and you get a much better fit in the model. And so if this is built on our theory, again, that voter psychological theory, that people do react more negatively to higher prices after a period of good times than bad times. So things are being triangulated here, I think, in our overall story of the impact of excess prices, even if, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a complete explanation for the vibe session here in 2026, which is somewhat different somehow.
Just interjection. I'm garrulous old guy here, but I associate the 70s. I associate stagflation with the taste of hamburger helper because I was working summers as an undergraduate as a research assistant, and my friends and I with our uh, dreadful shared apartment were using a lot of hamburger helper because we didn't know how to cook, and also meat was really expensive. It seemed so at the time. So yeah, it was. But it's interesting that the depths of that people were not as depressed, and you think that maybe they had already kind of internalized that the economy is tough or something, and
Yeah.
that's in effect what we're saying here.
They weren't as surprised. They've internalized high prices as something that could happen in their life, and perhaps I was but a twinkle in my daddy's eye in
Right.
1970. But I you can do a lot worse than hamburger helper. By the way, hamburger helper is just pretty. That's a good staple food for
Yeah.
your working class person
Yeah. Well, a lot of things. Yeah.
or otherwise.
Well, I had some roommates who insisted on soybeans with everything, and that I could have done without. But anyway,
Yeah,
um, it was the 70s.
I wouldn't do that.
So there's a question
Mhm.
of what do we think are the prices that people expected? And you've been using
Yeah.
basically fitting a trend to recent price movements, right? And
Right.
projecting it forward.
Right.
I think you're using something like the average inflation rate over the past 5 years to project forward. Or how are you getting that? And then let me tell you what my
For excess prices.
yeah.
It's
I mean,
the trend in prices, so I guess that is mathematically equivalent to the average inflation from the 15 years prior to whatever date you are
yeah.
predicting on, 15 years prior to the 5 years prior. So you look at the idea is that some people have formed their expectations for inflation some period over the last
So
10 years on average.
okay, so it's so now we do have independent measures of we have direct measures supposedly of what inflation people expect. We have uh, there's a inflation in the um, there's surveys again
Yeah, the UMich one. Yeah.
the Michigan but other surveys but especially Michigan does ask people what they expect the inflation rate to be over the next 5 to 10 years, which kind of gives you a medium term expected inflation. And um, there's a you can get an implied inflation forecast out of the bond market. The tip spread, break even inflation, whatever jargony stuff. But there is an implied inflation forecast, and so uh, those are not necessarily congruent with a lagged.
With
Just
the excess price measure. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so here's my question. I would there's a um should look at. But right now, let's say that consumer expectations about inflation over the next 5 years are somewhat elevated now. They're higher than they were. Um, I would have thought, but this is not, I think, the way it comes out in your analysis. I would have thought that that would make it easier to end the excess price stuff because if you want to have prices lower than what people are expecting, given that they're expecting higher inflation at this point, then they'll be pleasantly surprised if we only have 2% inflation. But I
Yeah.
think the way you're doing it, you're actually using that is not how you're doing it, right?
No, I'm not using the measure of the survey measure of what you would expect your inflation to be over the next 5 years.
Yeah. So kind of what
That
you're
doesn't
doing
enter at all.
is, as I understand, I'm sorry, putting you on the spot with stuff that's really hard to do on the fly, but
No, 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 that's okay.
what you're doing is sort of saying that people's expectation is inflation that is something like inflation over the last 5, 10 years, and that and um, and not really um, and you have actually used the expected inflation for the survey. It says, what if inflation is actually that high? And then it's going to be really bad. But I would have sort of turned that around and said, well, if people are already expecting pretty high inflation, so they'll be pleasantly surprised if it's lower than that. And that should make it easier to get back to a price level that people find acceptable. But I don't know if am
Yeah.
I making
Well,
sense?
yeah, you're making some sense. Maybe we are not using a psychological measure of excess
Yeah.
prices, and that is different from a survey measure. We are using an actual
Right.
mechanical level of excess prices from residual from the trend. So, one way to reconcile the fact that the um, objective measure of excess prices rather than the survey based
Right.
measure of excess prices is more explanatory. You could say people are bad at predicting prices in the future, just in general, which would be true, or that the survey isn't picking up on anxiety about the price level with that variable as well as you would expect. And one one thing to mention here is that the University of Michigan's measure of price, what I've called price anxiety, which is
Yeah.
just the percent of people who have a bad opinion of the economy. So take those
Yeah.
people, the percent of that people who attribute it to worse personal finances
Yeah.
is at an all-time high, and it surged in 2021, 2022, and stayed there, never came back down, which is similar, you'll notice, to the trend um, on consumer sentiment in the University of Michigan. I don't have the conference board data in front of me
Yeah.
or memorized. So yeah, it is possible that just people are like bad at predicting what prices should be. Um, one idea would be if we took the expected change in prices over the next year and like divided it by average CPI, in overall
Yeah.
inflation over the 10-year period preceding. I wonder if that number would be at an all-time high. That's a very easy check after the fact. I bet it would be near an all-time high.
Yeah. I mean, I always have probably getting too meta, but I always wonder, look, I
Yeah, we're
mean,
getting really wonky here now.
what we're trying to predict is a variable that is, consumer sentiment, which is not a behavioral thing. It's sort of how do people answer a questionnaire, and we're trying to predict it with. I mean, this question: should we also be using kind of questionnaire type answers to predict it, or should we be using? Obviously, at some level, we're interested in objective economic stuff, but I wonder
Right.
whether we should inherently prefer the objective economic stuff as a way of predicting. I'm not making a whole lot of sense here, but I hope that.
No, this is making sense to me because I spend a lot of my time thinking about the difference between um, our perceptions of objective reality and like these survey based measures for which for whatever reason can deviate from that. And um, my argument would be that we should be using the survey based measurements of anxiety in addition to our economic fundamentals, our structural variables, because our models and our job as modelers is infallible. And we can rely on the people when they tell us in surveys that they are anxious for whatever reason instead of pouring cold water on it because our models don't line up would be my opinion. But that does you are right. Of course, we want to know um, how people are reacting to objective conditions on the ground, and the only way you can really do that is by looking at the mass between executive positions on the
Yeah.
ground and some other outcome variable. So I'm acknowledging it's tricky. Yeah, there's no clear
Yeah.
answer, I guess.
So two questions left. S&P 500, by the way, again, if people don't know, that is the broad index of the stock market. That is clear. That really shows up as something that explains how people feel. Is that
Yes,
really showing?
the annual change in the S&P 500 is predictive of consumer sentiment, even after controlling for stuff like say annual change in CPI, PCE, etc.
That's really kind of interesting because the vast majority of Americans own very little stock. And the impact of the S&P 500 of stock prices on most people's economic position is really kind of small. I'm wondering whether that's a more like a signal. Where people like me are always saying the stock market is not the economy, but not clear that that's how people see it. I don't know.
Yeah, the S&P 500 also impacts media coverage quite a
Right.
lot, and in our models we try to control for negative media sentiment, but again our empirical analysis of media sentiment is often different from how people are interpreting this. So I tend to really land on one answer here, which is if you look at the polling on price anxiety, on the percent of people who are saying their situation is worse
Right.
because of personal finance issues, that's at an all-time high. And if you trust the people, that is pretty explanatory of consumer sentiment on its own. But
Sorry
it
again.
requires some hurdles to get there.
So sorry. What predicts consumer sentiment? I'm sorry. I kind of lost that.
It's chart 7A in
Yeah.
in the University of Michigan. It's the percent of people whose finances are worse that
Yeah.
say personal finances is the reason why.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, and at some level, if our numbers say that personal finances are actually better, but people say they're worse, at some level, the customer is always right. We shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes,
But
and
it
that's
leaves
one of
us
the.
at a loss for an explanation. It does leave us shrugging up.
Yeah. Um, Last thing, and just again, I'm throwing stuff out because I'm puzzling over this stuff myself a lot. And um, when a lot of these issues, they're kind of um, we're in some ways sort of harking back. I still always think that Morning in America in 1984 is in many ways a really sort of a crucible for making sense of all this stuff. But every once in a while, I say, 1984 as a year was uh, closer to the end of World War II than it is to today. And it was a very, very different country then. And I always wonder, I mean, I know you have to do this, but do you worry that just we're trying to get a model that fits just a society that has changed immeasurably over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if our so much of the vibe session discourse, not necessarily Kyla Scanlon's, but stuff like you know, I believe Nate Silver wrote this article for the New York Times opinion page that was about how the consumer sentiment index broke down. So after The Economist had done something similar, I
Yeah.
believe. So much of discussion of that was based on the idea that you could build a model of consumer sentiment historically. And now it's breaking down. And one conclusion from that is that people aren't thinking about the economy rationally anymore. But another conclusion is that they're thinking about the economy differently than they
Yeah.
have been previously. And that seems entirely legitimate to me. And if that is the case, then we should be looking at the polling data, I guess the perceptions data more and the fundamentals indicator less to explain consumer sentiment.
Okay. So the really big news to me, I mean, there's a lot that we've talked about, but is that we really are seeing sort of a second downward leg in the vibe session. That
I
there
think Vibe
that
Session 2.0, yeah.
are, yeah, which is really quite remarkable. And I mean, everybody knows my politics, and I think it's entirely deserved, but still think it's quite startling. So that's going to be a big thing. It's going to matter enormously in many ways, obviously in the elections, but so that's news to me actually. So worth highlighting.
Well, now you have a headline. There
Now
you
I
go.
do. Hey, gotta feed the beast on Substack. So anyway, as you
As
have
I
fun
know.
finding out right
I
now.
find that well, yeah. Well, look, I mean, in terms of in terms of consequences, Donald, and to bring it back maybe where we started, Donald Trump's approval rating on prices is like 30% or less,
Yeah.
70%, minus 40 or so. And that was the last time I looked at this, which was a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and he's been losing ground very fast. That is congruent with an electorate that is very upset about prices, even if the objective data don't explain why to us. So there's some triangulation of the anxiety in terms of evaluations of the president. And if that number stays as low as it is, then we should expect the type of rout in the midterms that is large enough to overcome, basically effectively, or the Republican cheating through gerrymandering over the last decade or so. That might be where I would leave it.
Yeah,